Hey, this is Prof. Hamilton. We're going to go through in 10, maybe 15 minutes, supply and demand, kind of the core model in microeconomics. So here we go. Again, just like the first chapter, this one is more detailed and will require a little more time, especially if you haven't had microeconomics as a course or it's been a while. But let me jump into it here. So here's our 5 learning objectives. In summary, it's about understanding this idea of how the consumers on the demand side match up with producers on the supply side, and the two come to some mutually agreeable price and quantity. Okay. So I wish it was quite that simple, but we'll work through here. So a lot of this chapter, or at least a few different times, it goes demand, ideas, and then switches to supply, and then does that in a couple different areas. So up front, I think I mentioned this in chapter 1 too. One thing that makes economics tricky for some people is that they're too smart, that they're like, well, what's this line? What's this line, the demand curve or straight line? And it's, yes, we a lot of times in the book anyway, we start with already knowing about this relationship between price and quantity. So anyway, we'll get more into that as the chapter evolves. Some of this is pretty obvious, though, in that one of, if not the primary determinant of how much people will buy is the price. And if you lower the price, that's an incentive for some people to come on board and buy your product. Okay, so that is, it says there in mathematical terms, price and quantity demanded are inversely related. Okay. Oh, they're going to draw this one for us here. Okay. So, like I said, a lot of times we'll just start with either a graphical representation of this downward sloping line, or later in the notes, a mathematical equation. And by convention, price is on the vertical axis, quantity is on the horizontal axis. And we'll get into that more here in a few minutes when we see some equations. But yeah, one thing to remember, again, as long as you got price and quantity going on the right axis, that it's going to be a downward relationship. Okay. One thing, and I don't like to say economists or economic professors pick on students with this, but there's kind of this subtle wording thing that price leads to a change in quantity demand. Or another way of saying that is that when price changes, we're moving along that demand curve. When other things change that aren't price or quantity, they are going to shift the demand, or at least potentially so. So we have this change in quantity demanded versus change in demand. Most people would say that sounds the same, which it does, but one is along the curve because it's price. The other one is anything else that would shift demand, like income or preferences. Okay. So yes, so an increase in demand would be a shift to the right at the same price, any given price, say point A. I don't know what price that matches up to. That would go up to, that would shift out to a higher quantity if you go down on the new blue curve. And then a decrease in demand is a shift in the left. Okay, again, this is from something, I don't think they specified here. Okay, things like this. Income. And I think there's a few slides here we'll talk about each of these a little bit more, but income could shift something to the right. Normally you think, well, yeah, if you have more money, wouldn't you buy more of everything? Well, not more of inferior goods. So depending on where you're at, initially maybe a $2,000 car is a normal good. At some point that becomes inferior as you kind of get middle income. At some point even a Camry becomes an inferior good. If you're a millionaire, you buy a an upscale car, luxury car, what have you. All right, price of other goods, so not its own price, but price of goods that are competitors or things that would go along, bought in tandem with the good in question. Marketing matters, other things like populations, expectations, so kind of get into the bigger economics here of how you can think about how many, really more than this list even, other factors that drive why we buy what we do. Okay. So yeah, so if you have a good marketing campaign, you'd hope that would push your demand curve to the right. Right. Skipped a slide there, but trying to move it along here. There's about 50 in this set, or 40 maybe. This can be a little imposing to people when we say, like, why do we have to use Greek letters, the alpha, as the coefficients? And just a quick note, well, just those are, we'll see a numerical example, which for most people helps to solidify what this is all about. What we can kind of think about is these other terms here. So this is good X, the price of Y and its coefficient. M is income, and then H is other variable, I guess it is. So these if we had numbers for these alphas and P, PY, M, and H, that would just be added to A0, and that would be our traditional form of having a demand curve. So here's a little bit of, well, the sign of the coefficient tells us something about whether the other good is a complement or a substitute. For alpha M, whether it's a normal or inferior good. Okay. So here's what I was saying. Here this makes things a little more solid when you actually don't have to look at all the alphas. So normally we would have, and again I'm pointing at my computer screen, and I know I'm also pointing at the camera, so sorry. But I'm looking at that top equation there. And yeah, so 12,000 minus 3px, that's normally all we would have in terms of an equation. But really there's more behind that. So the other variables, the price of other goods, Y, income, and again A of X, not sure what that was, some other factors. We can plug in, as it's done in the question here, for, well, here we have all the variables. But if we plug in for the unknowns, then we can simplify this equation. Okay? And we can actually, in this case, not just simplify, we can actually find the full quantity. Okay. Sometimes, well, instead of having Q equal to something, we can switch it around and have solve for price instead. It's really the same information. Sometimes this facilitates graphing, but it's basic algebra, which should come back to you really quickly if you haven't done algebra in a while. Okay, again, this was the graphing. Oops. Okay, oops. Oh yeah, let me go back there. There is a concept, and we'll especially get into this later in the book, in that, so here we have, I don't know what it is. Let's just say it's a liter of Coke, okay? Pop, if you're from New England. I think we have a few of our Salvation Army officers that are from up north. So anyway, to my point, the idea here, all right, so we don't have the supply curve shown, but evidently, say it crosses at $3. That doesn't mean two things. Number one, doesn't mean everyone buys it. Only, well, here it's only 2. Okay, maybe it's 2,000 or 2 people in the class or something would buy a 2 liter for $2. So we would have these other people that didn't value it at $3. It was only worth $2.90 to them, or $1.53 or whatever. On the other hand, for those that bought it, some of them actually valued it. They considered they got a really pretty good deal. So to take this person at the high end of the demand curve, they were willing to pay $5. Could be for a number of reasons. The two general ones are, number one, they really are thirsty in this case. They have a strong preference for getting a 2-liter. Secondly, they have the income here. It's not big money, but but they're willing, all right, $3, $4, $5, whatever. We need a 2-liter for the party or something, so they pay it. So the idea of consumer surplus is that kind of this implicit benefit that consumers are receiving, which is a good thing for consumers. Again, it'll be more in the second half of the course. We'll talk about kind of exploiting that, trying to find those people that are in a hurry or that really love a product, would pay almost anything, $5 in this case, for a product above what kind of the market clearing price is. Okay. All right, on to supply, and a lot of this is just similar ideas, just some, obviously it's coming from the opposite direction now in terms of price. So we have, go back here, the law of supply. Now as the price rises for a product, that would induce current firms to expand their output and maybe new firms to enter that market as it becomes more profitable, apparently, with a higher price. Again, we have this subtle, there's movements along the supply curve from a change in its own price. That's the only thing that can do that. And then everything else would shift the supply curve. So one thing here, and I did that quickly, I don't know if you saw the video, but an increase in supply is, again, think of pushing it to the right. And to some people that looks like a decrease that's kind of got pushed down. But okay, same thing, a decrease in supply is a shift to the left, even though kind of visually, the mental whatever way we process this, it kind of looks like it went up to the northwest, but it's really going down to the west, so to speak. So things that can shift the supply curve are various input prices, the wages they pay, what they pay for the raw materials, technology, how many firms are in the market, taxes, future expectations. So, but the most important one are usually the first two, that at least what we'll talk about. Okay. So here's an example with some taxes. Again, we don't need to focus too much on that right now. So I don't think there's any homework problems with that as well. Okay. All right, again, now they're using beta for the coefficients, so it looks a little imposing here, but again, the kind of the right half of this equation is these other variables that normally are, we'll go ahead and plug in for those, and those they're added to beta 0, the loan intercept. And again, we can probably this is a good place to jump back in. We can plug in, if we know all the right-hand variables and their coefficients, we can plug in and we can solve for quantity. Just like we had consumer surplus, we also have producer surplus. Okay. So here is something, let's just call it the TV market. And strangely, someone would be willing to sell it for $133 or something. Pretty low, but the market price was $400, so a demand curve is not shown, but we're supposing that it crossed there. So for some producers, it's just a little bit above kind of their lowest price that they would consider acceptable, maybe break even, or makes them enough profit to compete with other interests. Okay. And then market equilibrium are where supply and demand cross. Okay, so that's not too big a surprise. I've already mentioned that in a couple examples. Oops, we'll go back there. The book, this chapter, does talk about, well, what if we're not at equilibrium? So it could be something like a price floor, which you would think would be low, but if for some reason the government's said you cannot sell for less than a certain price, so the minimum wage is an example of that, then we're going to be in a position like this where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demand. So we're going to have a surplus of that product. Likewise, if we have a price ceiling below the equilibrium, we're going to have a shortage. So this could be you cannot sell your blood. You have to donate it. Okay, so the price ceiling is 0 for that and many other illegal goods. So this involves a little bit of algebra. We start with these two equations. You'll note here that we don't have any other other prices or income or anything else driving this. This is very traditional, kind of the simplified form for the equations. If we set the right-hand sides equal to each other and solve for price of $2 and then plug that back in to either or supply or demand, it will give us the exact same answer. And sometimes I write this as Q star. They say QE for equilibrium is 6 units. So I already mentioned that. Price ceiling. The book covers this in detail, so I don't want to take too much more time here going through the details. So that was just some numerical examples of how to solve for how much that surplus or shortage is. The last thing here is looking at shifting curves, how that changes our price, our equilibrium price. So if we have an increase in demand, that's going to drive up the price and also the output. Okay, kind of jumping around here. So again, that was increase in demand. You could also say there was an increase in quantity supplied because the price was driven up from the increase in demand. Okay, again, it takes a little bit of practice or focus, but it's in some ways it's just a economic silly terminology thing, but it does also have some meanings behind what curve moved and which one didn't in this case. And we could look at other examples if it was supply only, or if they both shifted. Maybe one goes up and one goes down, and they both go up. Okay. So there's a few examples here. Again, I know I'm going quickly. What let me do say is just power through that there. Yeah, if you're like, wow, I didn't get any of that. Kind of got overwhelmed. By all means, contact me. I'm not doing you a huge favor. I am. You're my boss in some ways. So you're taking your time out and you're paying, or someone's paying your tuition, and I'm more than happy to fulfill my capacity to help you understand this material. So some of these things, I think, for most of the class, what I'm doing here, the speed will be, pretty good. You still have to read the book, still have to practice some things, but by all means, if you are just like, some people just want to understand every point, which, all right, we can work on that too. But especially if you're just like, I just don't get these. This is a good example right here. This graph, when they've shifted the supply curve twice, and the demand curve has gone down, and there's all these straight and dotted lines. Some of this just takes a little bit of practice, so keep that in mind too. But again, I'm here to help, and we're gonna figure this all out together. All right, see you in the next chapter.